So in the beginning of the presentation, you start with the idea that based on our understanding of, say, Indian philosophy, we have this idea that we need to kill or annihilate our normal ego. And so I just want to ask some definitional questions about those words in this phrase, which sounds maybe on first thought like violent, or like we need to totally get rid of ourselves. And so you mentioned that we kind of want to hold off on those ideas a little bit. And so I want to start with the word kill or annihilate. Can you talk about some of the words that's being used to translate and what other valences they might have to kind of help us fill out the imaginary or the symbolic, some of the words that we might replace that with?
I'll use just one, which says it all, and Guru Nanak simply uses the term home marna, right? To literally means marna means to kill, to kill the ego. And again, it's not. It is a killing of ego, but it's designed to tell us that the ego is already dying in each and every second, each and every moment, each and every infinitesimal part of a second. The moment the ego is born, it's already dying, right? So embrace that dying, which is a part of life, a part of death. So it's the idea that life and death, two parts of existence, non-existence, are already imbibed within the ego when it's born.
So you could maybe also say, let the ego die when it's meant to, or when it's supposed to.
Yeah, that's a perfectly good way of putting it. Yeah.
And maybe something else, something that I think about, I guess, is that especially in a place like America, or when we think about Western philosophy, we're left with these existentialist notions of death. That death is the absolute limit of our ability to think or imagine. There's a lot of fear around this word as the final death that we have to face at the end of our lives. But my sense is that there's a lot of other meanings of death here too, that we kind of have to open up some of what we think about when we mean death. Is that, so when we say kill, we don't mean annihilate forever.
Yeah. I think the fundamental problem here is that when you and I talk about it, and we talk about death and life in this modern kind of context that we're living in, we also automatically assume a time frame which is precisely what the modern is. It's a particular notion of time in which things go from a start to a finish, and each moment in time is linear. Time is basically linear, and each second that passes is the same as the other one, and the next one is going to be the same, etc., etc. So death is always conceived within that framework as something absolutely final, as is birth is an absolute origin. But what Nanak seems to be suggesting here is quite the reverse, and what he's pointing to is a different time frame altogether. That time frame, that mode of time, he calls simply akal, which is non-time, or simply a different mode of time other than the linearized historical one, which creates a difference, an absolute difference between life and death. What he says in this time frame of akal is the fact that the life and death are completely intertwined. From the moment that everything comes into existence, life and death are part of the same moment. Each second is kind of fishing out, dying, and being born anew. And that's just a different frame of time, which in the everyday world that we live in doesn't factor in to our conversations.
We might also even think about that time outside of linear time as death. We might call that an everyday conversation, if you're thinking about your life in terms of work and fun and all these different things that need to sit next to each other in our daily life, and then we fall asleep and then it starts again. Anything that takes us out of that, within a certain materialist conception of our world, we might falsely call death.
Right.
And so kind of what I'm hearing is that we need to open up our definitions for these terms
We
a
have.
little bit to think about just the variety of experiences we might undergo and how to relate to those and how to think about the difference between those experiences in our daily lives.
Right. And just to add to that, what I've been saying about ego preservation and ego is that it works on the linear model of time. It cannot abide by the non-linear notion of time, that akal notion of time, because then it has to accept the existence of non-ego as well.
So to maybe move, so we've got this phrase, and so we filled out a little bit, maybe some of the other things and the other ways we need to think about the verb here, like to kill or to annihilate. So let's move to ego, as our object here. So you filled out this term and its preservation with a lot of psychoanalytic terms, which I think might be helpful to people who are working in those modalities, therapists who are coming from that background. I'm wondering if you can provide some other language, some other ways that we can think about what it means to preserve or cling to the ego. Maybe again, you could start with some of the words that you're using ego to translate out of Nanak's verses. What are some other ways we can talk about the ego? I think it's a good reference point for us to start from. But what are some other ways we can think about that?
Flesh that out a little bit more.
Sure. So the ego is a really loaded word. I think it can make a strict Freudian or Lacanian think very specifically about our socially conditioned, symbolically oriented self. But it might be a word that's more slippery or pretty loaded for someone who's either not familiar with it or people who are kind of resistant to the idea that their idea of self should be consolidated as ego. I'm wondering how else we might be able to describe this idea of self. Could we interchange, for instance, the word identity with ego? Or social identity? That's, I think, maybe some of the ways that people think about their self in the world. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. It's opening up so much that I think we might want to kind of leave that conversation for it's a bigger conversation to be had. It's just so much is crowding in my mind about the possibilities.
Sure, got that. So how about the word normal? That's a word that you kind of talked about, especially in the beginning of the presentation, in terms of some of the ways that Nanak might have felt uncomfortable or displaced by traditional Hindu society of the time. And so I want to try to translate this into the terms of today. There's a lot of people that might feel like they don't belong within the framework of normal identity. What are some of the dominant ways that the idea of like a normal social self might make people uncomfortable, and how might that, like today, and how might that relate to some of the spiritual practices that you're talking about?
So the one that I'm working with, particularly in this presentation, is simply to try and make a connection to, and I think it's a very real connection, to the idea that Nanak was one of those people in a period of several hundred years in the time when Islam clashed with Hinduism, broadly conceived, where there was a clash of two completely different civilizations, many different languages, etc. And the idea that I think what he was trying to do was to develop and show that you can have a totally normal existence where you're crisscrossing between cultures, between languages, between thought processes, hybridizing them. And this is the term that I've used before is heterogeneity. Is that for him, language does not have an identity, thought does not have an identity, concepts don't have an identity. They work through self-differentiation. So the idea of self-differentiation that I've applied to ego applies to language, to concepts, to social existence, etc. I wonder if I've left anything out there.
There's a lot of axes of
Right.
identity.
So there is no normal as such. In fact, the normal, both in Nanak's time and in our time, is the meeting, the encounter between differences, different people, different thought processes, and for people to, we're made to feel as if that's abnormal, as if there's something wrong with us, if we're not thinking in the way that we should be doing it, not having stable identities, for example. So what it does is, what Nanak is showing is that normal, the one that we're forced into, is actually illusory. We're living in an illusion. You just watch The Matrix. The Matrix is a great way of kind of just turning that whole thing around. And that's what Indian philosophy has done from the very, very beginning. It's problematized any world in which ego creates a sense of normality, which means a sense of self-preservation. And so the worldview is expanded. And if for those of us who live in expanded worldviews, from the moment we're kind of born, expanded notions of language, of social identity, etc., multiple social identities, that's absolutely normal. And what we're doing is just flipping the axes around so that that's real, that's normal, as opposed to, what the dominant symbolic order tells us is normal.
So maybe one question to ask from there is, you kind of hinted at the fact that there's a lot of ways that society, when it trains us to be people, asks us to think of a single unitary identity as what should be normal. We could give that a variety of names in different cultures or different contexts. But I think there's a lot of people that would feel a lot of anxiety or persecution, both at the level of like how they view themselves and materially, from that feeling of being multiple, of not fitting into the dominant trends of society. Does that anxiety or that relationship to self, can that be a starting place for moving towards these transformative experiences? Can feeling like you're not fitting in be a resource for the practice of self-differentiation?
Yes, emphatic, yes. And that's unfortunately, that is precisely what gets pushed into the realm of the not real by the dominant systems, whether it's modern psychology, modern medicine, etc. Because of the way that they define what it is to be absolutely normal, real, identical, etc. And it's all centered around a notion of identity as absolute self-sameness. I don't know if I'm going there. You may want to kind of bring me back to where you wanted to go with that question. But.
Well, no, so that helps. So on the one hand, there's a set of values that, say, American society would uphold. That whiteness is normal, that straightness is normal, that those things are required to participate in society as an American citizen, And there's a lot of people that feel that they don't fit into that single category, just to kind of bring us to a concrete example, who feel multiple because those are the identities that are associated with normal. And that looks different in different contexts. You know, we can bring that back to traditional Hindu society and the way that those values made Nanak feel multiple, feel as though he was not normal. And the way you narrated his story was that he took those feelings and used them to help realize or become more aware that actually that false ego, that false unity that is put up as the highest value of society is illusory, and that we need to embrace self-differentiation as our practice of being in the world. And so I think what you're talking about in terms of also society trying to push away non-normal experiences, extraordinary experiences, things that feel as though they're outside the world, and to try to kind of keep them at arm's length, either by studying them as something which happens elsewhere, or studying them as non-normative states of consciousness, or, you know, we could even talk about the way that, you know, the way that religious experience kind of gets tagged as this bizarre thing that should stay out of, you know, politics or something like that. I mean, I think those are related. Both of them use this idea of normality to kind of, you know, govern the way that people think about their own difference, either their experiences as a particular identity, as multiple, as many different kinds of identities in one, or their experiences of something that maybe doesn't fit into the prism of linear time, or that maybe feels like death, or feels like it accords with some experience that was described by someone who's not from their own time and place. Is that an accurate kind of connection?
That's actually a very, very well articulated conception of what was going on in this lecture, actually. I'm not sure I can do better than what you just said. It's really beautifully done.
That's very kind. I'm just trying to kind of give a different set of terms to restate this, because part of what you're saying, a lot of this is linguistic. And we kind of have to capture something which is telling us that silence is important, or that an experience that's hard to describe is important. And so that's just going to push on our terms of language constantly. And so all I'm trying to do is restate this a bunch of different ways that feels right, so that hopefully people have something to catch on to. Does that make sense? Yeah,
I think the question that I think becomes important here is, how do you put this into operation? How do you, I wouldn't say normalize it, but how do you kind of, apart from trying to experience this in the mornings before we go to work, or in self-help groups, you know, or at retreats, how does one politically make this work? That's the key thing, and the only way to do that is literally to critique, to break down dominant worldviews, and to denormalize these shallow notions of identity that we've come to accept. And you know, that has to enter into education from a young age, so that we're normalized into this different transformatory experience, so that it's not supernatural or anything like that, right? It's just absolutely just the way things are. Yeah.
And so I think it's also important that you're connecting structural political change to the importance of experiencing something that has to occur outside of these structures, and that those two things are bound to each other and not inherently opposed to one another, because there's, you know, within the society that we live in, I think people, for lots of good reasons, hold very dear to the terms in which they're representable to the world as an identity. You know, say, you know, like, someone that there's lots of good reasons to be suspicious of the effort to dissolve or question your identity, especially for groups who have just been recognized politically along their terms of identity, queer people, people of color, immigrants, and people are still really fighting these battles. And so there's lots of good reasons to hold very dear to those social identities, but at the same time, there's still potential, I think, in this system to value the experience of getting outside of yourself. And to not hold those things as opposing one another. Because those experiences aren't transcendental. They don't take us permanently somewhere else. They bring us back to those social identities with a better awareness. They reorient. I'm just trying to throw in some more helpful words.
No, I agree. I think this is the impasse that we've come to in contemporary politics, contemporary society, is that at one time, let's just take the extreme example of identity preservation and the misuse of social identity, egotism, etc., which is basically the rise of the resurgence of the right, of Trump, and these factors that have caused the pushback against globalization, all that kind of stuff. At a certain time, not long ago, 15 years prior, possibly 20 years ago, one could rely on a kind of a leftist kind of language to push back on the structures of the right. But the thing is, you look carefully at leftist language, rhetoric, etc. It's all coming from the same place as the right. And just to cut a long story short, basically identity structures are kind of entrenched in our entire political landscape. Its language, etc., etc. The question is, how do you again bring this perspective in to mainstream thinking when it's already stereotyped as Oriental or as non-worldly, as you quite rightly said, and that is something I don't think I can completely answer. But until that move happens, I can't see major changes taking place.
Yeah, I do see some more immediate potential here.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, maybe there's a potential for a different idea of identity, which does not require a certain kind of stereotyping for representation to be possible. I mean, that's a future that would change the face of democracy, or at least what democracy promises to do for us at the level of representing our experiences and opinions and beliefs. But there's also, I feel like, potential for a kind of healing or a kind of affirmation of oneself as different.
I don't know whether you've read Nick Land at all, but I mean his thing used to be so Nick Land came straight out of Bataille, and his thing, the book that he wrote was The Thirst for Annihilation, right?
Not Fanged Numenon.
Oh, that's his later stuff,
Okay.
but the Thirst for Annihilation, it's so reminiscent, the moves that he's making, and he's coming straight out of Bataille, but the moves that he's making are so reminiscent of this language of killing the ego, etc. What he says that is, in order for this to happen, in order for this language to take root, there has to be a general collapse of society. And he then, I think, after the mid-90s, began to talk simply in terms of societal collapse. And the word collapse became a central kind of metaphor for him. I'm just wondering whether that it needs to be as dramatic as that, basically.
I mean, certainly there's a lot of the language of negation here: annihilation, collapse, destruction.
Aren't we back into that whole life or death thing? Yeah, either life or death.
there needs to be a subtler approach to it, because so much of it comes out of Marxist political rhetoric, literally killing people,
Yeah.
which certainly historically we can't argue that failed. But one wonders if some of this affirmative practice, which often in its political form has come in the way of people telling you to kind of accept the way things go, that kind of take a transcendental posture about this to say that these experiences happen outside the world, and so no matter what's going on politically, you need to always be above it or outside of it. They take that ascetic principle of needing to leave the world and internalize it, and say ignore the politics, ignore your identity, get outside of it and kind of live there, and whatever you need to, just let things happen as they may, you have this world outside of it. Whereas, this kind of much more engaged, affirmative, taking these experiences back, idea of taking these experiences back into the world, tries to bind those rhetorics, which are often kind of apocalyptic, of structural change and the kind of annihilation that needs to happen there, and the kind of structural change in the way we think about identity and relate to ourselves that need to happen at an individual level. And there's to me, there feels like a lot of promise there, and so much is filled out in the translation and reconception of these like poetic exercises and spiritual practices.
And the interesting thing is that I think this is very relevant and reminiscent of, I think what Nanak was doing in his difficult and turbulent times, and the turbulent times that we're kind of living in as well, is to change the nature of language, which is the nature of consciousness, not to get out of language, but to change it from within and to change the structures from within.
I mean, one of the main things we can do as individuals, as people who are relating to ourselves, who are helping others relate to themselves and each other, is just, change rhetorically how we talk about these experiences, identity, create new imaginaries that are kind of attuned to the way that we need to come in and out of being aware of these dynamics, feeling in the world, so to speak, engaging with politics versus spirituality. I mean,
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is the last thing I'm going to say because time is running out, but I think that a lot of that hinges on taking the world back, as opposed to being pushed out of the world, and this kind of language being pushed out of the world. It's bringing this language back into the world, but also taking the world back as well. I think that's the thought that needs to, we kind of need to play with.
That's, as you mentioned, the danger of taking all of these experiences, whether it's God or Shabad, self-destruction, and saying those aren't worldly, those are metaphysical.
Right.
Like, that's a power play,
right?
Because those are really powerful tools for self-transformation and the transformation of society.
Right.
That future remains to be written. But
and interesting, I know we're kicking off each other here, but that has something to do with the secular and the religious as well, as having framed the entire language that we're kind of working in.